All right, does this work? All right, well, thank you, Mother Mary Kay. Ethics is what we do. Virtue is why we do it. Virtue ethics is the point at which action and motive connect. The Christian way of virtue ethics is to grow into the likeness of Christ through a lifetime of disciplined practice of Christ-like virtues or qualities of character. It is about the inner good of who we become rather than the external good of a reward. But that raises the question, what's the point of becoming virtuous? There are actually 3 points, and the first one isn't about us, it's about others. Virtue makes us better parents, better spouses, neighbors, communicants, and citizens. It's like wearing a mask after you've had the COVID vaccine. You do it for the other person. But we do get 2 things out of it. A virtue is an excellence at the art of living. We are given just a few years on this earth, and we don't want to miss them. The virtues bring us fully alive. With prudence, we're able to see reality. With fortitude, we have the courage to engage it. And with justice, we can have authentic relationships. We'll see today that temperance is equally vital to a life well lived. The second thing we get out of virtue is about eternity. The virtues shape our minds. And as Milton said, the mind is its own place and can of itself make a very heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Well, our experience of eternity depends on who we become, and becoming is what we do here. William Blake said, "We are put on earth this little space that we might learn to bear the beams of love." Christian virtue ethics holds that the core of the Christian life, not all of it, but the core, consists of 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, and 4 cardinal virtues, prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance. First, we considered prudence, the mother of all virtues. Prudence is wisdom in practical affairs, seeing things clearly as they really are and acting sensibly. The first commandment of prudence is deal with the real. Next, we considered fortitude, mental and emotional strength in facing difficulty, adversity, or danger courageously. Last week, we considered justice. The Christian virtue of justice is about right relationship. It starts with our relationship with ourselves, and out of that inner balance, we can relate to other people. The starting point for right relationship is to know others as real persons who taste soup, dream dreams, and have feelings at sunset, not as tools, mirrors for our egos, or screens for our projections. We make a moral practice of empathy, imaginatively seeing the world through others' eyes. Now, these virtues are interwoven. Justice is possible only if we have the prudence to see ourselves and others, recognizing the sensible action, and then the fortitude to do it. When I hear the things some people say, for example, I think that their head must be one scary place to be, and I'm not sure I want to imagine my way in there. So it takes fortitude to say with Abraham Lincoln, "I don't like that man. I must get to know him better." Prudence is possible only if we have the will to see reality, which is born of justice, and then the fortitude to face the facts. Fortitude depends on the prudence to see our challenges and deal with them sensibly, and the justice that cares enough to make it worthwhile. So today we consider temperance. Dictionary definition: moderation or self-restraint in action, thought, or feeling. Self-control. Its synonyms include equanimity, calmness, serenity, forbearance, self-denial, judiciousness, measure. Now, during the presentation, I invite you to try to recall people you've known, preferably personally, who have been temperate. And if you can, think of times when they have had to exercise restraint and you've seen them show you how to do it. And you might think of times when you yourself were challenged to exercise restraint and moderation. For Plato, temperance included 4 elements, none of which is sufficient in itself, but all of which are necessary. First, quietness of soul that comes from self-acceptance. Second, the humility of knowing our limitations. Third, minding our own business, because we're contented in our own life. We don't judge others and meddle in their affairs, and we do not become consumed by ambition. Fourth, self-awareness, the Delphic oracle's adage, know thyself. Aristotle considered temperance the most important virtue, and Euripides called it the noblest gift of heaven. It is the virtue with the greatest cross-cultural consensus. Confucius taught that modesty and self-control were essential to a humane life. Gautama Buddha included temperance in speech and action in his Eightfold Path. But he said it doesn't come easy. Buddha said temperance is a tree which for its root has little contentment, but for its fruit, calm and peace. Lao Tzu made moderation the center of the Tao Te Ching. He wrote, "Filling all the way to the brim is not as good as halting in time. Pounding an edge to sharpness will not make it last. Keeping plenty of gold and jade in the palace makes no one able to defend it. Those who stand on their toes are not steady. Those who take long steps cannot keep the pace. Those who show off do not shine. Those who are self-righteous are not prominent. Those who boast are not respected." Hinduism teaches even nectar is a poison if taken to excess. And Muhammad said, "Do good deeds properly, sincerely, and moderately. Always," this is Muhammad, "always adopt a middle, moderate, regular course." So Anglicanism became committed to the Via Media way back there. The 17th century Anglican priest and poet Robert Herrick wrote, "In things a moderation keep, kings ought to shear, not skin their sheep." So did our American forebears toss moderation overboard on their way here? Apparently not. Lord Byron, of all people, said, "America is a model of force and freedom and moderation with all the coarseness and rudeness of its people." Abraham Lincoln, the exemplar of American political temperance, said, "The demon in temperance seems to suck the blood of genius and of generosity." It's in the 20th century that our troubles began. In the 20th century, moderation and temperance were widely repudiated. Oscar Wilde said, "Moderation is fatal. Nothing succeeds like excess," which will lead us eventually to Barry Goldwater's adage, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." But compare that to Aristotle, who said the virtue of justice consists in moderation as regulated by wisdom. Or as George MacDonald, the role model of C.S. Lewis, put it, moderation is the basis of justice. But Ann Coulter disparages moderation per se. She speaks of it with great contempt. And a leftist friend of mine agrees with her. He calls moderation complicity with evil. Right-wing Ann and my most progressive friend agree because they are both following Eminem, who sum it up for the modern era. Yo, I can't do anything in moderation. I don't know how. So let's recall two historical examples of excess as an intentional way of life. First, there was the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, summarized by Ian Drury and the Blockheads in their anthem for the era, "Sex, drugs, and rock and roll is all my brain and body need." Well, the 60s, you may recall, ended with several exclamation points. One was a series of high-profile drug overdoses, Joplin, Hendrix, Morrison, etc. Another was the Altamont Rock Festival, which featured 4 accidental deaths, 5 live births, a Hells Angel murder of a gun-toting 20-year-old, and their knocking out one of the Rolling Stones on stage. Finally came the Manson family murders, intended to incite a race war. So in reaction to the hedonistic excess of the 60s, we got the religious excess of the religious right. That brand of religiosity organized around 2 things: maximizing the intensity of emotion associated with religious ideas and an emotional devotion to religious celebrities like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, James Dobson. So sex, drugs, and rock and roll were out, family values were in. Christian right led us to Eric Rudolph's bombing of the um, Centennial Park, Olympic Park, and of a lesbian nightclub in Atlanta. Then Scott Reeder murdered an abortion doctor in a Wichita Lutheran church, prophesying that God's judgment will sweep over America like a prairie wind. James Kopp murdered a doctor in Buffalo. Then closer to home, another Christian extremist murdered 3 people at the Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood clinic, noting that's the hometown of Focus on the Family. Randy Weaver of the Christian Identity Movement, which advocated death for adulterers and gays, shot it out with federal authorities at Ruby Ridge, Idaho. The Adventist breakaway, David Koresh, formed the Waco cult, in which 76 people were killed in a gunfight with law enforcement. As revenge for that event, Timothy McVeigh, also of the Christian Identity Movement, bombed the Oklahoma City Federal Building, killing 168 people and injuring 608. From these 2 examples, the 60s and then the Christian right, is that extremism in one direction leads to extremism in the other. It's as if any extremist ideology is actually a pretext for extremism itself, the passions running loose. And today, we are living with the implications of decades of valorizing excess over temperance. Thankfully, we have a few contemporary voices for moderation. Donna Hicks, in her book Dignity, calls moderation the foundation for the life of dignity. But the best of the modern voices is Julia Child, who said, "Moderation, small helpings, sample a little bit of everything. Those are the secrets of happiness and giving." Now, there is a reciprocal relationship between virtues and spiritual experiences. Moral practices can open us up to spiritual experiences, but spiritual experiences can also teach us virtues. People use various ways to access spiritual experience: prayer, meditation, chanting, fasting, Tai Chi, yoga, psychedelic drugs. I would not presume to prescribe which of these is right for you. But in 1569, one day, Michel de Montaigne had a profound experience by a method that I do not recommend. He fell off a horse, hit his head, and lost consciousness, but his body was convulsing and thrashing about. His companions, in a panic, took him home, where the horrified household rushed about, crying and wringing their hands. But Montaigne was actually aware, and Montaigne felt as if he were floating above the whole scene, just watching it. He could see his body flailing. He could see everyone in panicky distress. Montaigne, however, felt utterly at peace until the whole thing passed and he recovered. From that point on, he had a new perspective on his life and the world around him. Out of that perspective, he wrote his famous essays, which became the philosophical backdrop to Shakespeare's plays. The plays are full of passion. Romeo and Juliet plunge into fatal romance. Macbeth's ambition leads to war, his wife's suicide, and his own ruin. King Leontes, in a fit of passion, jails Queen Hermione and orders the murder of his best friend. But Shakespeare is the author, in control, writing the story and watching it performed, like Montaigne watching the drama unfold in his bedroom. Now, Christian temperance isn't aloof detachment. It cares, but from a perspective of serenity. As T.S. Eliot put it in Ash Wednesday, teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. Temperance cares without losing the balanced, serene, curious center of the self, which Eliot calls the still point of the turning world. Our total personality includes subpersonalities, passions, ideas, and inclinations that are often in conflict with each other and charging off in this direction or that. But the serene center holds us together. And we're always at risk of being taken over by a subpersonality or a passion, especially if a situation or another person is pushing our buttons. The serene center does not deny those impulses. It tempers them. It moderates the staff meeting going on inside us. It helps the parts of ourselves negotiate their compromises so that we are able to behave moderately with others, including in the public square. There are 4 playing fields in which we can cultivate temperance. First, our inner being, moderating our feelings without denying or suppressing them. Second, our personal life of family and close friends. Those are the people who are best able to push our buttons. So that's where we most need our serene center to be still, ask questions, and listen rather than react impulsively. The third playing field is our voluntary associations, like our church, our HOA, our bowling team, or our garden club. One blessing of voluntary associations, religious or not, is that they develop the civic virtues necessary to public life. The fourth playing field is the public square, where we structure our common life. Now, last week, two surprising things, surprising at least to me, two surprising things happened in the Southern Baptist Church. Not all, but multiple pastors called for repentance for the church's complicity in the Capitol riot. In Texas, Jonathan Davis said, "If you hold a Jesus Saves sign while violently storming a civic building in a fear-driven, anti-democratic attempt for earthly political power, the basis of your faith is way off." In Knoxville, Pastor Bill Ireland cited Hosea, "Those who sow the wind will reap the whirlwind." The second event was an op-ed in the Baptist News by North Carolina pastor Steve Shoemaker. Pastor Steve said that it will take two virtues. First of all, we hear Baptists talking about virtues, and I'm saying, whoa. Pastor Steve said it will take two virtues to heal our nation. The first is justice. He said, "We as a nation cannot move forward toward healing without the civic virtue of justice." Pastor Steve continued, "We also need a second virtue." He called it forbearance, corresponding to what we are calling temperance. He quoted St. Paul, "Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." Now, justice and temperance in the public life are a kind of paradox. Pursuing justice requires compassion, and that has passion in it. We need a powerful emotional motivation to do the hard work of justice, but that can be a slippery slope into intemperance. Passions blow like a whirlwind in society, and we can get lost in them. We can lose ourselves in them. Participating in the public square, but with temperance, for justice, but with temperance, is a delicate balancing act. Parker Palmer calls it a paradox. He says, "If I didn't have the idea of holding paradox to help me understand myself and the world around me, I'd be more lost than I am. Holding paradox means thinking about some, but not all, things as both ands instead of either ors." Palmer says that paradox, two truths or two values, both valid in themselves but inconsistent with each other, creates a tension we are tempted to resolve too quickly. We want to go with one or the other, or to find a middle ground compromise. He urges us instead to hold the tension, to honor both until something new arises out of it in time. Temperance is intentional awareness of both sides of a paradox with the discipline of holding them in tension. I'll wrap up with suggestions for two forms of practicing temperance, inner and outer. For inner temperance, simply pay attention to your feelings, but do it in a disciplined and intentional way. If you think you are thinking, stop and find the feeling behind your thought. Find it in your body and just notice it. Don't try to erase it or change it. Don't even judge it. Just let it be. Let the healing power of your awareness do its work over time. For outer temperance, get to know the other side. Think of whoever or whatever it is that upsets you. Then approach the other side with, keyword, curiosity. Try to learn something, a story. Nelson Mandela started as a Gandhi devotee of nonviolence, but just as a strategy. He was only committed to it so long as it seemed to be working. Mandela lost patience, became a violent revolutionary, and went to prison for decades. While in prison, Nelson Mandela had a problem. The food was ample, but they served the whole day's food at once. So his lunch and dinner were cold. He needed a hot plate. He wanted to ask the guards for a hot plate, but they were white, so they wouldn't speak to him. Mandela was smart. He listened to their conversations with each other to get to know them. And he discovered that they talked constantly about one subject, football. Now, in those days, Black South Africans despised football as a white man's game. But Mandela needed a hot plate. So he went to the library, got the sports magazine, and read up on the current football. Then he'd go out on the yard and call out to the guards, "How about them Broncos? Did you see so-and-so do such and such?" Next thing you know, they were talking, and he got his hot plate. Out of that experience, Nelson Mandela adopted a new operating principle. If somebody was saying something that made absolutely no sense to him whatsoever, they must know something he didn't. So he asked the guards questions. He didn't explain to them how wrong apartheid was. He asked questions, and just by his open curiosity, he converted the guards. He kept on asking questions, all the way up the power chain to F.W. de Klerk, until he had questioned South Africa out of apartheid. So, practice curiosity. If Black Lives Matter marches, push your buttons, talk with a Black friend, or read a Black novel. Read Ta-Nehisi Coates, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, or Maya Angelou. If the radical right strikes you as simply crazy, learn what makes them tick from sociological studies like Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild or American Fascist by Chris Hedges. Problematic passions in society, like problematic passions in our own hearts, do not go away by being ridiculed. We start by seeing others from the serene center of our being. We can hold fast to our own sense of morality and still engage others with curiosity rather than moral indignation or personal contempt. Now, if you hear me saying, as someone always does, if you hear me saying just go along or even compromise with evil, tolerate the intolerable, I'm not saying that. I'm saying just stay in your center and try to understand. That's temperance in the public square. All right. Well, Mary Kate, how many people do we have? 14? Let's do two groups.
At 14, we'll do two groups. Let me stop the recording.